Welcome again. My name is Jim Pietrowicz, if you haven't seen me in the last couple sessions. And just so you know, I'm the Director of Business Development for Auros Knowledge Systems. Thank you again for attending. This is beginner track number 3, where we're going to discuss the SEED project. Our presenter today is Josh Kullis. He's the Technical Services Manager and Knowledge Aware Consultant at Auros Knowledge Systems. Before I turn it over to Josh, I want to just remind everybody to keep that chat open. Hit those questions and hit those questions and comments as we go through the presentation. We'll definitely have some time at the end to address them. We appreciate your attention and attendance today. And now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Josh.
Thank you, Jim. I'm going to share my screen here. Oh, sorry about that. Looks like I've got a solicitor at the door. We will not enter them. So this presentation is going to be focused on the SEED project and really getting started. We want to talk about, what an implementation of the knowledge aware concept of, Auros IQ looks like at an organization. So we'll kind of walk through the high level steps of the process and, talk about what goes into them. Why do we do them? As we started using Auros, 6 or 7 years ago to track our implementations and track the onboarding of workflows, it's something that we find benefit in, and we want to walk through what that process looks like. So for our learning points for this particular presentation, we're going to look at a roadmap for what an implementation looks like. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the common challenges that we'll face, and then we'll talk about some of the best practices that will help us adhere or will help us face some of those challenges. So the first item is the roadmap. So what does this look like? We've done a lot of different implementations at a lot of different organizations. Jeff Mayhew talked about the one at Navistar a little bit earlier today. We're going to see a lot of examples of implementations from different customer sites over the next few presentations. I think we have some today, and then we have a good number of customer presentations tomorrow. But in general, we like to try and frame out what an implementation looks like. What is the roadmap? What are the steps that are on it? So this is a high level visual that will kind of let us talk about the different steps. We're going to do something that we call a briefing, and we'll go through all these steps in more detail, but I'm going to go through them very high level right now. We're going to do something we call a briefing. So we want to educate people on the process itself. What is knowledge aware? If there is benefit to implementing something like this, we want to then scope that project out. Where do we start? What does it look like? We'll then execute the project. We'll then take that project once we have something that's production ready. We're going to transition it into production. And then after that, we really have, we will go through that process multiple times in something that we call adjacent seed development. So we want to do more seed projects. We want to do more implementations, onboard more workflows. As we start to do more, we're going to get increased awareness. We're going to see a lot of people understanding the value of Auros to the point where, we then get to this point where it's demand-driven growth. And that demand-driven growth is, we're no longer going out and selling the software, but rather people are coming because they know that the value is there. And at a certain point in time, when we continue to get mature, we continue to onboard new workflows, we want to get to an enterprise capability. So Jeff talked a little bit about a knowledge operating system, Jeff Moffa, in his presentation earlier today to open the conference up. And that enterprise capability is really having this knowledge operating system that provides a platform for anyone to manage knowledge, deliver it into processes, and kind of fill in all the gaps where the document-based approach may present some challenges. So we're going to go through these different steps in the roadmap. We're going to talk a little bit about each one. We're going to give an overview of them. So for the briefing, this format is going to be similar for each of the points. We're going to talk about the purpose of it. Why do we do this particular step? Then we'll kind of go through an overview of how it works. And then we're going to talk about the deliverables. So at the end of it, what is it that we're looking to get out of that particular activity? So the first one is an Auros briefing. Like I said, a lot of times when we go to organizations, the concept of knowledge aware is something that's foreign. It's a foreign topic. People are so used to using knowledge or documents to manage their knowledge that they don't really know what knowledge aware is. It's a concept that is growing. It's something that we really see taking hold in different places, but not everyone knows what it is. So for the briefing, what we want to do is we want to come in, we want to start to educate people on what knowledge aware is, the benefits of the concept, how it can be done. And essentially what we're looking for is identifying key stakeholders within a process, within an organization. And we want to ultimately develop their buy-in on the concept. So if we come into an organization and the knowledge aware process doesn't really seem to be a fit for them, that's okay. But generally when we come in, we'll find organizations or we'll find people within an organization that are having challenges, they're struggling with things, and communicating the concept and how we can change the way that knowledge is captured, shared, or reused, delivered into our processes, evaluated, is what we want to do through this briefing. So there's a lot of different material that we'll use for that, but essentially we're going through and we're educating organizations, ultimately with the goal of wanting them to buy in on this concept that there is a better way to manage our knowledge. And then we would proceed to the next step in the process, which is the scoping session. So the scoping session is something that we've found to be very valuable when you're trying to get an implementation of Auros started. And there's really two uses for this scoping session. We want to frame the implementation out. And when we do frame the implementation out, there's two things that we generally will see this project charter, which is the deliverable. So we're going to do a scoping session to frame the implementation. And at the end of that scoping session, we're going to produce a charter. And that charter is not a contractual document or anything like that. But what it's going to do is it's going to help us communicate the value of the project. And there's two main areas that communication we found has been really valuable for organizations over the past few years. The first thing is just getting a high level understanding of what the implementation looks like. We said that the approach is very different. It's bottom up. Traditionally, enterprise softwares are top down. So Auros is an organically grown software, and we start very small and we start to get bigger. So we want to frame out kind of the high level roadmap of what that looks like. That allows you to communicate it, to people. It allows us to understand when we do the project, what things we need to focus on. And that charter will help to kind of keep the focus of the project as it matures through its life cycle. But the other thing that we found, that was the purpose of us doing these scoping sessions originally. What we found over time is that this charter is actually used quite a bit as an internal sales tool. So we'll come in, we'll educate organizations, we'll talk about the knowledge aware concept, but then people buy in, and there are a lot of different stakeholders that need to be convinced, so to speak. This project charter can be used as a mechanism of communicating the value and really selling the concept and selling the project across the organization, whether it's to people that might report to someone, maybe there are management peers that need to be convinced of something, or even you can use the charter to communicate up the chain to your boss or to higher level executives the value of doing a knowledge aware implementation. So this scoping session, we really want it to frame out what the project is going to look like. It'll help us put together a roadmap of what knowledge aware looks like at your organization. But then it can also be used as a sales tool to kind of communicate that information across different groups. Once we finish the scoping session, we get the charter, the next step in the process would be to do a seed project. So this particular presentation was titled the Seed Project. It's really about the implementation altogether, but the seed project is going to be one of the big parts of that. And the seed project is the way that we onboard a workflow. So when we go in and we start talking to groups, there's a lot of different things that are going on. The biggest challenge that we face in all of our implementations is the culture change. People are used to doing things a certain way. Change a lot of times is uncomfortable. We think that's a good thing. There certainly are times that it's a bad thing too, but we want to be able to manage that change, and we have different things that will help us manage that change. So when we do the seed project, we come in, we try to understand as much as we can about the process. We then will want to educate the organization on the way that the software works, the way that the knowledge aware technique can be applied to what they do. And at the end of the seed project, which we talked about a couple sessions ago, will generally take 15 weeks. We've done them in as few as 2 weeks. We've done them in as many as 20, 25, but generally it's about 15 weeks. And at the end of that, we're going to have a production ready workflow. So production ready workflow means, if we had a project that started today that needed to do whatever the activity is, we could use Auros to manage and track that project. So the seed project is really the first point for which we start to take the knowledge-aware approach, apply it to an organizational process, apply it to an organizational activity. And at the end of it, we're going to have this production-ready workflow that will allow us to start realizing the benefit of continuous learning, preventing recurring mistakes, all the stuff that we've talked about in the last couple of sessions. So once you finish the seed project, the next natural step in that process is going to be transitioning it to production. So we have a process that's production ready, but we don't necessarily have everyone in the organization using it yet. So we talked about managing change. This transition to production is really focused on managing the change. So we want to put together materials like, training, work instructions that we may have to create. We want to understand who are the people that are going to use this software or are going to use this process. When do they need to start? How do we train them? Where are they located? Who are all the people that we need to communicate these things to? When it gets started, how are we going to manage the use of the software? All those kinds of decisions we need to make sure we've gone through and talked about, so that as we get into the process, managing the change is really just a product of the plan that we put in place, and we want to execute that plan. So like I said, the change management aspect of this is the most difficult part. The points and clicks in the software, after you become familiar with them, are really quite straightforward. But managing the change of an organization, transforming the way that you capture, share, and reuse knowledge is something that's difficult. And this transition to production aspect of our process really helps us to manage that change as long as we put a plan in place. We get organized and then execute that plan. And at the end of this particular phase or step in the process, the deliverable is going to be that production workflow. So it's not production ready anymore. It's actually in production. People are using it. We're starting to realize the benefits of the knowledge-aware technique. So then we talked a little bit about adjacent development at the beginning of this presentation, but essentially what we just walked through, when we do adjacent developments, we're going to do those same things, just do them again. So the purpose of the adjacent development is this organic growth that we talked about. We have one workflow, it's adaptable, people start to see the value. We're then going to find, maybe two other ones. We'll run seed projects on those particular workflows. We'll onboard so that we now get to 3. Those 2 may turn into 2 more themselves. So now we have 4 additional ones. So we get to the point where we have 7 different workflows, and we're starting to see this organic growth, right? And at the end of the adjacent development, similar to what we had at the end of the seed project, it's just in more areas. We're going to have production workflow. And the other thing that the adjacent development does is it increases the awareness of the value of the knowledge-aware technique. So increased awareness is a really big part of what we do. When we start off at organizations, we'll start a lot of times very small, sometimes with workflows that are 5 or 10 users. And what we've seen as we continue to promote the concept and as people continue to see the value behind it is that growth really starts to take off as the awareness is increased. So we'll talk a little bit in a presentation later today about how that's happened at our organization. I know Jeff talked about it when he showed the slide with the statistics of our workflows and so on and so forth. We'll go into that a little bit more. But this increased awareness, what we'll see is the growth chart of the organization, kind of start slow. And at a certain point, when we get this adjacent development, the awareness increases. We start to see the spike of software usage. And then that's what we talk about when we say demand-driven growth. So we're not really having to go out and do briefings or do scope. We still do scoping sessions, but we don't have to go out and sell the software anymore. People are starting to see the value of it. The awareness is increased. And instead of us going out, promoting it and trying to get people to understand the concepts, what happens is people get to the point where they understand it. And then the growth is demanded, but they're coming to the people who manage Auros at their organization saying, hey, I have workflow A, B, and C. Can I put those in Auros? Or this group is doing this over here. Do you think they could put that in Auros? And it's a result of the adjacent developments, the initial seed project, and that increased awareness that helps us get to the point where we have this demand-driven growth. And in this particular situation or this particular scenario, the demand-driven growth, the deliverable of that is the enterprise capability. So that last step in the process is really what we're trying to go towards. As we are on the journey, this demand-driven growth gets us to the point where we have this enterprise capability, and as different challenges arise, we're able to address them. The continuous learning, the continuous improvement, the prevention of recurring mistakes is something that is a capability that's delivered to the enterprise, not just a solution to a particular problem. So to recap, we went through the roadmap. We have the 7 steps. We go briefing, scoping session. We then do a seed project. We take that seed project, we transition it into production. And then essentially we take those 4 steps, we repeat them for the adjacent development so that we can increase the awareness. As we start to increase the awareness, we then get to the point where we have demand-driven growth, which ultimately ends up in the enterprise capability. We talked about some of the common challenges, communicating this within an organization. There are different tools that we use, like the chartering document, to help us communicate, help understand the value that the knowledge-aware technique and the approach will give to organizations. And then some of the best practices that we talked about as we go through that process. We use the seed project to help get to the adjacent development. We use the adjacent development to help get us to demand-driven growth. So those practices and kind of that process that we walked through, they really are the best practices to address the challenges of traditional approaches or maybe projects that were unsuccessful in the past, and being able to implement the knowledge-aware approach, like we said here, managing a change in a bottom-up implementation, which is different than a lot of enterprise softwares, which are typically approached top-down. So I think, Jim, that was the presentation to this point. I guess, do we have any questions?
Yeah, Josh, thanks. We do, actually. Harsha from Autoliv. Again, Harsha, thank you for another question. Keep them coming, man. It's all good. He asked, what is a typical business value indicator you or your customers measure for evaluating the benefits?
Yeah, the typical value indicator is going to be the mistakes. So we go to organizations a lot of times and we'll hear terms like lessons learned. We'll hear terms like read across. But we'll talk to these organizations and they'll say, we make the same mistake over and over and over and over, and we want to have a solution to ensure that we're not going to make those mistakes again. And what Auros does is it takes the document-based approach, which a lot of times is disconnected. It's difficult to communicate information in documents when you have multiple versions, multiple copies of these things. And when you have information in a central location, you don't have to worry about whether someone has the most updated version of the document. That value kind of speaks for itself. It's very difficult, as Jim, to measure and put numeric values behind. But we do have use cases across our customer base right now, including ourselves, which we talked about a little bit earlier in Jeff's presentation, where we can start to assign dollar values. Now that people have done this, they've seen the value that we can get out of it. But I would say the thing that organizations focus on generally at the start would be the prevention of recurring mistakes. If you have a mistake that happened and it caused you, to have to retool something that was in the plant, it's going to cost you a lot of money. So if you can prevent that mistake from ever happening again so that you don't have to reproduce tools, then the software a lot of times will pay for itself, or the concept will be proven out in those particular scenarios.
I had another question from Sung Young at Hannon as well over in Korea. He asked, so from a briefing to demand growth, it'll take about 7 years like Navistar?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think one of the things that has been a common theme so far today is really this idea that knowledge aware is a journey. It's not necessarily something that comes in and gets, the switch gets flipped automatically. We want to provide this capability. But with any other organization, it's difficult to change. It's difficult to manage that change. People are comfortable with what they do. And a lot of times there's some effort that goes into it. So I think depending on the size of your organization, depending on the way that your management is oriented to the organization, how acceptable they are to change, those kinds of things, it doesn't always take 7 years like Navistar, but it definitely isn't something that happens overnight. And I think that's because of the human interaction aspect of it. Managing change in any area, whether it's knowledge management or anything else, does take some time.
Got another great question from David Perkins at FCA. Many of the example implementations so far have been related to product design and development. Is that the focus of most seed projects? I'm interested in Auros as a tool to manage CAE input data. Have you been in similar implementations there? Oh, sorry, my screen just moved. And then he also says, or can you give an example of the most unique seed project you have been involved in?
Yeah, we do have customers that have explored using it for CAE input data. So it's conceptually, I'm not aware of anyone in production that is doing that, but from a conceptual perspective, it's something that can be used when you're talking about managing CAE input data. So I can definitely reach out to David and we can talk more about that and what he potentially is looking for and some of the challenges that they face. But the most unique seed project that I've ever been a part of, we've done some internally that I think are different from what people would traditionally think of when it comes to managing knowledge. So we've done seed projects in our business development group. We've done some seed projects in our marketing group. We've done some seed projects with our finance group. We actually do our expense reports in Auros. We'll talk a lot about how Auros uses the software, but from a customer perspective, that's a good question. I don't know if this is necessarily the most unique, but the one that was extremely, fulfilling for me or whatever you want to call it, we did do a seed project with the BorgWarner Group on project management. And they had a lot of different metrics that they tracked for their program managers. And they found that, like 60% of time for their group was spent doing non-value added work. So they had 60% of people's time was producing reports or going and chasing information down. And only 40% of what they were doing was actually value add to the company. So that particular project for me was pretty fulfilling because we were able to reduce that down, below, I think 38% was the target. And we were able to reduce that down and take a lot of the unnecessary effort out of their process. Not sure if that is considered unique or not, but it was one that I had quite a good time doing.
We'll have more to follow up with you, David, on that one for sure, but great question. Got time for another one. Dave Matthews from BAE asks, are there standard rule sets with Auros? How do rules get implemented in a typical implementation?
Yeah, I think the standard rule sets would be, the value table editor. So the way that you author knowledge is going to be standardized. The different ways that we configure a community are going to be standard. But the thing that Auros is really built on is being adaptable and flexible for the different needs of the different groups that are going to use the software. So I'd say the platform has standard functionality and standard rule sets, so to speak, on how you capture information, how it gets delivered to people, how it gets evaluated, that kind of thing. But as far as creating standard rules for information that goes in the knowledge packet, it really isn't something that we do, and that's because we want it to be applicable for all the different areas that you want to continuously learn, you want to prevent recurring mistakes, that kind of stuff.
Josh, we got time for one more, but it's another really good one. It's from Susan Bachman at GM. So she says, at GM, we have an organization that is coming up with some great ideas for projects, but I want to narrow it down to one strong choice with the most chance of success. When deciding on a seed project to pursue, what criteria have you found that are key to selecting the one to choose?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Susan. We have some material that we can actually provide to you that will go through this in a lot more detail than what I'm about to say. But I think the key to selecting a project that's going to be the most successful is finding the one that is going to balance the need for the managing the change. So depending on, we want how difficult is it going to be to manage the change and how much value is the project going to provide? If we have something that's going to provide a ton of value, but there's 1,500 people involved and they all have their own opinions and everybody could veto the project, managing that change is going to be really difficult, right? What I just laid out is probably unrealistic, but if that were the scenario, managing that change is going to be very, very difficult. If we're looking at an organization, though, where there's not a whole lot of value, but managing the change is going to be easy, we might not necessarily want to pick that one either. So it's understanding the balance between the value that's being provided and how difficult it's going to be to manage the change. It's really not an exact science, but we can certainly reach out to Susan. We have some material to go further in detail of what I just talked about.
Thanks, Josh. And thanks, everybody, for attending today and your great questions. We really appreciate it. I think there's some good stuff there at the end. As in past sessions, I've just linked the SurveyMonkey into chat. If you wouldn't mind taking a minute to fill that out. Again, let us know what you liked. Let us know what you didn't. Be critical. We really want the good, honest feedback there. We continue to improve year over year with this conference, and your feedback is definitely appreciated and taken into account. Our next session begins in about 4 minutes. It's how Auros uses Auros. Josh referred to it a couple times in this talk, so I hope you all turn out for that one. We'll hope to see you soon. And again, thank you for participating.